Hello friends, in this video we will address the very interesting and fascinating question about the origin for the practice of tithing. Is it true that returning tithe began with ancient pagan civilizations such as Babylon and Assyria? Anyone who is studying the topic of tithing will want to review this history as it has significant implications for what Christian churches teach and practice today. If it is true that returning tithe is of pagan origin, then why have Christians adopted a pagan practice? It is a well-known archaeological historical fact that many pagan nations of antiquity practiced returning a tithe to their gods. A dictionary says, the payment of tithe is a practice both ancient and widespread, being found among many peoples, Semitic and non-Semitic. An encyclopedia says, the custom is very ancient and widely practiced, being known in Athens, Arabia, Rome, Carthage, Egypt, Syria, Babylon. Many ancient pagan nations and cultures practiced tithing, but this begs the question of how. How so many different and separate civilizations all happen to share the same percentage of the tenth. Again, as is noted by many scholars, it is a fact that tithing was a widely spread custom in the ancient world. The Roman historian Pliny documents that the Arabs returned tithe to their god Sabbath, the Phoenicians and Romans to Hercules, the ancient Sumerians to their gods Ningal and Nana, Assyrians to the gods Ashur and Raman, Carthaginians to Melkarth, god of Tyre, the Greeks tithed to Apollo. Ancient clay tablets record the Babylonians returning tithe to their gods Bel and Nebo, etc., etc. The ancient Babylonians, Assyrians, Carthaginians, Greeks, Romans, and others mentioned tithing for religious purposes, and not just one time. They did so continually. This begs two questions. Number one, how? How did so many detached and separated peoples all happen to arrive at the 10th? Why didn't different nations arrive at different numbers? And importantly, how did they all know that the 10th was due to God? All of these ancient and great civilizations, they shared the belief that the 10th was due to God, that this was specifically an act of worship. Now, where did they get that idea? It is very helpful to consider the timeline. According to the biblical view, from the creation of the world until the flood was approximately 1700 years, or around 2350 BC. And then after the flood, another approximately 350 years until Abraham. As anyone who has studied tithing will know, Abraham is the first person recorded in the Bible to return tithe. And it is estimated that he lived around 2000 or 2100 BC. There are people today, there are churches today who teach and promote that Christians should return a tenth to support the great and important work of evangelism and preaching the good news of the gospel in order to lead people to Jesus. But there are other people who oppose this teaching and who say that Christians don't have to support preaching the gospel. They say that tithing was a very well-known common custom in the time of Abraham, and that Abraham, in returning tithe, was simply following an ancient pagan practice. But this, of course, begs the question of how. How was it already a common, well-known practice in Abraham's time? From the time of the flood until Abraham, there are only several hundred years. And yet, within such a short span of time, tithing was already a common practice among so many different peoples. But how? How can that possibly be? They all just happen to magically arrive at the number 10, and they all just magically, mysteriously came to share the belief that the 10th was due to God? That doesn't make any sense. That defies reason. For example, in the year 2005, Dr. David Croteau, a professor of Greek and New Testament, published his doctoral dissertation, A Biblical and Theological Analysis of Tithing, and on page 197, in reference to this history of the ancient pagans, stated, quote, "There is nothing in nature, and no one can reason, that 10% of all one's increase should be given to God." So again, The idea that all of these ancient nations just happened to mysteriously and magically arrive at the same number, the 10th, and to believe that it was due to God, that defies reason. There has been only one explanation ever proposed that makes any sense, that either at or before the flood, there was a divine revelation that the 10th was due to God. No other explanation has ever been proposed because nothing else makes sense. For example, in a research paper published in 1942 at Butler University, the author reviewed the historical evidence and stated, "Indeed, there is no other way of accounting for the universality of this remarkable law other than attributing it to God through revelation." In the 1980s, a researcher at Biola University published a paper on tithing and said, "The historical evidence of the widespread practice of tithing among pagan nations is perhaps the biggest single thorn in the side of those who advocate tithing is done away with." People who oppose tithing have a huge problem because they have no way to explain these historical facts, and as I've demonstrated in other videos, their most common response is to just try to avoid or ignore this and hope that their audience doesn't see what they are doing. Even Dr. Croteau, who admitted that there is no way humans can arrive at this by reason, even he himself, in a several hundred-page dissertation on tithing, never makes any attempt to explain this problem. And Dr. Russell Kelly, the person who has arguably done more than anyone else in modern times to make popular the claim that tithing was pagan in origin, is Dr. Russell Kelly. I personally interviewed him and asked him on video for the evidence that tithe originated with pagans, and he admitted on video he has zero evidence for his claims. And as to why they believed it was due to God, again, he has zero evidence and still can't answer the question. For decades, people who oppose tithing have cited Dr. Kelly as some great scholar and theologian who has proven that tithing originated with pagans, but when he was interviewed in person and finally asked directly where is the evidence, he admitted that his claims were false, that there is no evidence. This, of course, is a huge blow to the anti-tithing community. The Biola University paper continues by making a good point that people who oppose tithing, quote, must face a question rather similar to a difficult one which Jesus once posed to the Pharisees concerning John the Baptist. See Matthew chapter 21, verse 25. To borrow his phrase, tithing was from what source? From heaven or from men? If he answers from men, then he must respond to the difficult question of how the ancient pagan nations arrived at the 10th and believed it was due to God. If he answers from heaven, he concedes a crucial point to supporters of Christian tithing, for he then admits that God divinely instituted the tithe principle prior to and apart from the Mosaic law. That is a very good observation, and it explains really well why people who oppose tithing never want to address this history, because it causes them a major problem, just like the Pharisees. They don't want to answer the question because they will lose no matter what they say. And to make the problem worse, this is not new. This archaeological evidence from ancient history has been a key fundamental argument used repeatedly for hundreds of years by people who promote tithing. And yet, despite being used repeatedly for hundreds of years, the people who oppose tithing have never been able to provide a response. For those interested, the most well-known research on this topic is The Sacred Tenth, a 2-volume scholarly series by Dr. Henry Lansdale, originally published in 1906 and free to read online. Another commonly cited author is Thomas Comer, who wrote a book on tithes way back in the 1600s. He cited much of the same evidence and made the same arguments that are still made today. None of this is new. These arguments and evidence have been presented for at least hundreds of years. And it is very important for us to make the critical distinction between the words history and origin. There is a huge difference between the words history and origin. Yes, there is certainly a history of many nations and civilizations returning a tenth to their gods, but nobody knows for sure where exactly is the origin. For example, there is also a history of marriage between a man and a woman, but the history does not prove an origin, for we know for a fact that the origin of marriage was Eden. There is also a widespread history of blood sacrifice, but we also know that blood sacrifice originated with God. Abel offered the first recorded sacrifice, and he did so according to faith, and faith is defined as hearing God's word. It also is of divine origin. So, a history of something does not prove its origin. However, despite this fact, it is common for people who oppose tithing to claim that tithe was pagan in origin, that it originated with the pagans, but they have absolutely zero evidence for this. However, scholars and historians admit that while there is certainly a history of this, nobody knows exactly where it originated. For example, a leading international academic publisher, Brill, published a collection of Old Testament studies, one of which cites research for the history of tithing, and on page 116 states, and I quote, "These studies make clear that tithing is a very old ancient Near Eastern practice, although its origin cannot be what? Cannot be ascertained." And on page 127, the time of origin of the tithes is what? Is unknown for lack of old data. The data which can be found in ancient Near Eastern literature reach back to about 2000 BC. People who oppose tithing commonly make the claim that tithe is pagan in origin because they are trying to imply or insinuate that this did not originate with God, that Moses was later instructed by God to borrow this practice from the pagans, and that Abraham and Jacob must have been following a pagan practice. But not only do they have no evidence for their claim, but the evidence that is available suggests the opposite. For example, in addition to tithing, there are at least 3 more practices or beliefs among ancient peoples that suggest divine revelation: the Sabbath, practice of blood sacrifice, and narratives of a great global flood. In many languages around the world, the word for Sabbath is the same word for the 7th day of the week. Examples of many include Bulgarian, Greek, Arabic, Italian, Russian, Spanish, Sabado, Sabtu, Al-Sabd, Sabota, Shabbat, Sambata. How is it possible that all these different nations and civilizations all happen to use the word Sabbath for the 7th day of the week and not for any other day? Did they all get together and have a committee meeting and flip a coin? The only reasonable answer is that way back in ancient history, before the confusion of languages at the Tower of Babel, everyone knew that the Sabbath was the 7th day of the week. This is the only logical explanation. No other day is called Sabbath, only the 7th day. That makes no sense unless you have the Bible and realize that this began with the week of creation. And the same with sacrifice. It is an undeniable fact that ancient civilizations and peoples practiced blood sacrifice, but there is no rational explanation at all for this except for divine origin. Secular archaeologists, anthropologists, historians are completely perplexed, and they have no way of explaining the universal nature of blood sacrifice. But the Bible provides irrefutable proof that this also was of divine origin. As was mentioned, Abel offered the first recorded sacrifice, and he did so according to faith, and faith is defined as hearing God's word. It also is of divine origin. And the flood, Dr. Morris asks the great question, why? Why does nearly every culture have a tradition of a global flood? There are legends of a global flood found all over the world in many different cultures and civilizations. And this makes sense with the biblical record. The ancient people on planet Earth shared in common a knowledge of the Sabbath and tithing, blood sacrifice, and the story of a global flood. And while secular historians are completely mystified as to how this happened, it is in perfect harmony with the Bible. One of the principles of tithing is that not everything in our possession belongs to us, but this principle was true even in the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve, before sin, this is before sin, humans were never allowed to use everything in their possession. A portion of their possessions was set aside by God even in the Garden of Eden before sin. Man was created with free will and the freedom to choose, and in order to prove their loyalty and obedience to God, a constant, continual test concerning their possessions was necessary. The only way to prove that Adam and Eve are not robots and that they have free will is to provide some objective, measurable, definitive test that demonstrates that they are exercising free will to choose to obey God. To demonstrate the reality of free will, there must be something in their physical lives, in their physical environment, to prove that Adam and Eve are making a constant, continual choice to choose God or to refuse Him. Furthermore, something else that deserves our serious consideration is that many people, especially today, are so hostile to the concept of tithing. You can preach about many things and people will not get upset. You can give sermons and messages on almost any topic and people will not have any problem. But the moment any message touches the wallet and their money, it is very common for people to become resistant and upset. The topic of tithing often agitates and disturbs people and generates responses of hostility and bitterness. They become annoyed and irritated. They don't like it. Many people today hold the practice of tithing with derision and contempt, but this proves the very important point that humans naturally hate the idea that a portion of their possessions does not belong to them. People want to believe that everything that they have is theirs to do as they wish, and the idea that a tenth belongs to God is met with, by human nature, with disdain or opposition. But this only proves and highlights that the natural human heart is against this, which makes it absolutely amazing that so many ancient nations and civilizations practiced and believed it to be mandatory to return the tenth to God. Dr. Robert Webb, a former chair of systematic theology, described in a report the fascinating phenomenon that, quote, heathen peoples maintained for centuries an ordinance which continually operated against the covetousness and selfishness of the human heart. This is what makes this history so fascinating. Returning tithe is not only something you cannot arrive at by reason, but it is something people naturally don't want to do. It is an act of self-denial. Yet, all these ancient peoples did this. And it was not isolated to just one tribe here or there, but was widespread among so many very different civilizations. In the year 1855, another author asked the same question. Now, whence came a custom so contrary, highlight the word contrary, so contrary to our selfish nature to be thus universal, and exactly the same in its amount, unless it had been derived all over the world by tradition from one and the same source? And what would have had sufficient force to cause so general an acceptance of such a what? A self-denying law as that of tithes, except the original command of God Himself, preserved after the dispersion at Babel by a universal tradition founded on a deep conviction that it was one of the very most important acts of divine worship and designed to be observed by all men in all ages. So in summary, one of the best evidences for the continuity of tithing, one of the best evidences that this is of divine origin, is the archaeological historical fact that so many ancient nations and empires and civilizations practiced this and believed that the sacred tenth was due to God. As the research paper noted, for those people who oppose tithing, this historical fact is a thorn in their side because the only reasonable explanation that has ever been offered is that the obligation to return the sacred tenth was given by divine revelation either at or before the flood. And the most well-known voice claiming otherwise, Dr. Russell Kelly, has openly admitted on video that his claims were false. He has never had any evidence. Finally, in closing, it is an often repeated statistic that Christians, at least in the USA, only give about 2.5% of their income, and that only a small minority of Christians actually return 10% or more. In many forms of popular Christianity today, it is very common for people to claim that we are not compelled by the law, we are compelled by the love of Jesus Christ. But if that's true, why does the love of Christ compel Christians to give less than the ancient pagans? It is a sad observation that modern-day worshippers of Jesus give less to their message than the ancient Babylonians gave to Bel and Nebo. The Sumerians gave to their gods Ningal and Nana. The Assyrians to the gods Ashur and Raman. These people who worshipped idols of stone and wood gave more than most Christians who worship the risen Savior. Jesus said that unless your righteousness exceeds the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. One author made the observation that modern Christians don't need to worry about exceeding the righteousness of the Pharisees because they won't even exceed the pagans. The ancient pagans were more generous than many modern-day Christians. The Bible, however, says that Christians must excel and abound in the grace of giving. But how do we excel if we give less than both the ancient Jews and the pagans? One author asks the great question, shall not the offering of intelligent Christian love exceed those of pagan fear and superstition? If you want to learn more, be sure to check out my other videos. I highly recommend watching the interview with Dr. Russell Kelly, where he not only admits that his claims were false, but he issues retractions for his statements. Thank you for watching, and as always, have a great day.